Hey, it's Lou, and here's the thing. We need to have an honest conversation about marijuana, because right now, in the US at least, we've got two sides, fearmongers and cheerleaders, and lost in the mix is reality. Here's the truth about marijuana. We don't know a ton about it, at least not scientifically, and you can blame the federal government for that. In 1970, Richard Nixon's administration classified marijuana as a Schedule I drug, alongside heroin and meth. Schedule I drugs are deemed to have no medical value. Bo Kilmer, the co-director of the RAND Drug Policy Research Center, told me that makes studying marijuana extremely difficult. In fact, to this day, there's only one place in America that is legally allowed to grow weed for research. That's the University of Mississippi, for whatever reason. And scientists have to jump through a ton of bureaucratic hoops to obtain that pot. Now, with very little academic analysis coming from the scientific community, the government has been the main institutional voice on marijuana. And they've spent generations now shit-talking it for political purposes. In the 1930s, marijuana gave law enforcement officials an excuse as to why they were unable to stop crime. Essentially, what are we supposed to do? These guys are high. There's simply no stopping them. And then Richard Nixon came to office and noticed that many of his enemies, like the counterculture, smoked pot. A war on hippies doesn't sound great, but a war on drugs, well, you can sell that to the law and order crowd. It made Nixon seem strong. Over the years, many politicians and the mainstream media outlets that cover them echoed Nixon's anti-marijuana stance.
We haven't begun to find out all of the ill effects, but they are permanent ill effects. The loss of memory, for example.
Over time, people realized that the government's view was, well, at least overstated. There's a ton of reasons for that realization. A big one, many Americans experimented with pot and realized, oh, this didn't turn me into a criminal, I didn't die, I didn't go insane. And then they started thinking, why are we spending so much money arresting, prosecuting, and jailing people who use marijuana? In fact, a 2013 poll shows that 72% of Americans think that government efforts to enforce marijuana laws cost more than they are worth. Plus, the medical marijuana movement has clearly helped many people, especially cancer patients facing chemotherapy and folks who suffer from chronic pain. So, support for marijuana legalization keeps growing. Quick aside here, this study demonstrates that the more music you listen to, the more likely you are to use marijuana. John Hudak, who wrote Marijuana: A Short History, told me there's long been an association between music and weed. In the 1920s, joints were called jazz cigarettes, and Louis Armstrong's famous song Muggles is about reefer. Anyway, now that weed has become more mainstream and more acceptable, I wonder if we've gone too far in championing the drug. In particular, is the media whitewashing the risks associated with using marijuana?
That can not only heal a multitude of illnesses, it's going to heal the world.
NORML, the pro-marijuana group, keeps a record of newspaper editorial boards nationwide that are anti-marijuana. In the late 1980s, more than 150 were anti-weed. By 2016, that number had shrunk to about 30 or 40. And many of the nation's most prominent papers, like the New York Times, have advocated legalization. Ricardo Baca, the first editor of the first weed section of a mainstream media newspaper, that's the Denver Post, told me that for years, the media was deceived by what essentially amounts to government propaganda about the ills of pot. Now coverage is more balanced, but he does think there's been a bit of an overcorrection. Another pot expert told me there's almost a race to see what millennial-driven outlet could be the most pro-weed. I'm talking about all the glowing pro-marijuana pieces I've seen on Vice and HuffPo and BuzzFeed, and even Bean. One of our first episodes was on weed, and it was pretty positive. But here's my thing. We still don't have a ton of long-term studies on marijuana. The largest academic review of marijuana studies, published in January 2017, states, I quote, "A lack of definitive evidence has resulted in insufficient information on the health implications of cannabis use." While acknowledging that caveat, the academic review did, however, find that smoking cannabis on a regular basis is associated with respiratory problems. Cannabis use is likely to increase the risk of developing schizophrenia and other psychoses. Plus, cannabis use prior to driving increases the risk of being involved in a motor vehicle accident. Now, After looking at all the marijuana literature out there, the first thing that review recommends is that there should be more studies. Because in the absence of studies, people turn to anecdotal evidence. A popular CNN documentary featured an epileptic girl whose life was transformed by marijuana. But a fascinating Denver Post series revealed that many epileptic patients experienced false hope from that documentary.
If a family asks me if I recommend marijuana therapy for epilepsy right now, I tell them that I do not.
Some even relocated to Colorado from across the country to access legal medical marijuana, but did not get the desired results. And speaking of anecdotal evidence, let's talk about YouTube. A study has shown that YouTube videos that teach you how to make edibles frequently lack warnings and information on portion size and potency. And that could lead to problematic highs, paranoia, anxiety, chest pains, etc. The other thing that sort of drives me crazy is when people point out that marijuana is safer than alcohol. I definitely understand and accept that argument, but alcohol is clearly very bad for you. It's destroyed lives, it's created a huge drunk driving problem, it has all types of negative health effects. I'm saying this as someone who frequently drinks, love me some IPAs. But come on, alcohol is an extremely low bar. But look, I'm a live your life type of person, and to be clear, I'm no Puritan, I'm not advocating for prohibition or anything. I definitely do a shit ton of stuff that is bad for me, including drinking, eating junk food, indulging in other things. And by and large, I think people can do whatever they want as long as A, they don't hurt others, and B, they understand the consequences and don't deceive themselves into thinking unhealthy behavior is benign. A poll from a few years ago found that 60% of 12th graders think weed isn't harmful. 60% of 12th graders are wrong. Marijuana stunts brain development in young people. There may not be a ton of studies on marijuana, but there's plenty on that fact. So look, if you want to use weed, that's your choice. But understand the risks, the science, and the lack of science. Because self-deception is the worst type of drug. Okay, I'm gonna go live my life. By the way, my last question when I interview experts is always, what's the one mistake you're afraid I'm going to make when I tell this story? This time around, I heard the same thing from multiple people. Do not use puns. It cheapens the discussion. Andrew Matranga, the first journalism professor to focus on marijuana journalism in particular, was really adamant. So I won't do it. But Dushyant's gonna come in and read some pun-filled headlines.
Marijuana publications proving to be a pot of gold. Smokeless in Seattle. Hail Mary Jane legalizing marijuana. Joint effort. The FBI reaches out to pot-smoking hackers. Seattle's budding economy, pot tourism. Chris Sims's marijuana denial is dubious at best. Marijuana stocks could be a buzzkill. Yes, we cannabis. That one's real bad. Sanjay Gupta endorses medical marijuana, says the DA is just blowing smoke. The highs and lows of using marijuana. Blunt trauma. Marijuana, the new blood diamond. My cushy new job. The history of cannabis in Colorado, or how the state went to pot. Ex-spy lobbying on weed to no basis. Woolsey represents hemp in uphill fight. Recreational marijuana industries planting roots in Sacramento. High praise. Pot churches proliferate as states ease access to marijuana.
That's enough.
All right, well.